Okay, it seems that we're already live on the air. With this is one more broadcast of Dojo Live, and today we're gonna have a very special guest, and I'm gonna ask the viewers to please bear with me. And there's no way I can hide it. You can see my eyes watering, all that. Just that I have a little problem with the contact. I mean, last minute thing. Sorry about that. But we're going to have a very special guest today. We're going to have Mr. Keith Rollag, and he's the associate professor at Babson College, and author of the book What to Do When You Are New. We'll be talking about the book in a minute. And also, I want to thank my fellow Nearsoftian, Carolina Gonzalez. She's broadcasting also. She's joining us from our headquarters in Hermosillo. These are the Mexico City offices, by the way. So, Keith, I really appreciate your having agreed to be here with us today. And of course, we're going to be with you in a minute. And Carolina, also, thank you for being here. I think your participation is going to be of the utmost importance for our purposes. And Carolina is going to tell you why. Carolina is her role at Nearsoft is she is a specialist in talent acquisition. So I'm going to start talking right now, and I'm going to let Keith do the talking now. Keith, what do you have for us today? I understand you're going to be talking to us about what to do when you are new. Can you elaborate a little bit on this and about your book, of course? And welcome to the show, Keith.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate being here. I am talking to you from Boston, the United States. I'm looking out the window right now. It's about well below freezing, and there's snow on the ground. So imagine that's what's out there. I'll take a few minutes to tell a little bit about my book that was published about 4 months ago. And then I'll tell you a little bit about sort of the main topic, a few things that are in the book, and then I'll turn it over to Carolina and Carlos, and perhaps we can have some questions, and I'm happy to tell you more, and we'll go from there. I should say that estoy aprendiendo español un poco.
Wow.
It's regular, I would say. I'm slowly getting better at it. So anyway, here's the book.
Cool.
This is called What to Do When You're New. It's available both as a hard copy book like this in bookstores. It's also an ebook, and there's actually an audiobook version too. So if you really want to be bored and to sleep at night and you just can't sleep, you can buy that and listen to whoever they hired as the voiceover coach to do it and listen to it. So anyway, the book is basically built on the idea that it's almost impossible these days to be successful or to achieve anything we want out of life without putting ourselves out into new situations. Whether that's getting a new job, whether that's getting promoted or transferred to a new place, moving to a new location, even going back to school, or even deciding you want to learn a new hobby. All of those things require you to go out and meet new people. It turns out that is something that, unlike our ancestors, who for probably until a few hundred years ago, or even 50 years ago, were rarely ever new that very often in their life. There would be a few moments when they were new. There was a few moments where they would meet a stranger, but it was a relatively rare event. These days, we are new all the time. In fact, we find ourselves in new situations almost every day. In the United States, the average person will work in over 13 different organizations and will move over 11 times, and I suspect that's similar in other places. And over the course of your career, over your life, you will meet thousands and thousands of people. I mean, finding yourself in new situations is something that happens every day, even as something as simple as going to a new restaurant and encountering people there. So over the last 20 years, I've tried to research and understand what's the difference between people who seem to be very comfortable and confident walking into a new situation, surrounded by strangers, getting up to speed quickly, getting integrated into their organization, and what's different from those people from others who are a little more reluctant. It takes longer to get in. They find that after a while they sort of regret that they didn't build the relationships that they wanted to. And through that research, I've found that there's sort of 5 skills that the people who tend to be more successful and confident in new situations have. I think I'm going to show them here. They're not necessarily that surprising, but they are things that if you can get better at or more comfortable at, people I've seen have been a lot more successful. And I will say at the outset, this has really nothing to do with whether you're introverted or not. I've met lots and lots of introverts who, while they may not want to be around big parties and social events all the time, they at least have gained these particular kinds of skills to be very successful in new situations. And here's what they are. So the first one is sort of, how confident are you to simply go up and introduce yourself to strangers? You know, the second one is simply, once you've met those people, how good are you at remembering their names so that the next time you meet them, you're able to recall that name and all the good impression that comes from that. The third one is simply asking questions. I found that one of the things that predicts whether someone is successful in new jobs is often just simply, are they willing to walk down the hallway and introduce themselves to somebody they don't know and ask for help and advice. People who are willing to do that tend to be a lot more successful than those who talk themselves out of talking to people. The third and fourth skills are simply, once you've met somebody, are you willing to take the effort to turn that relationship into whatever kind of relationship you want? If you move to a new place, it's building a relationship with your neighbor. If you're joining a new job, it's building relationships with your coworkers, with your boss, all those kinds of things. And then finally, the last one is, when we're in new situations, we almost always have to do things that we're not good at yet. You know, we're either a beginner or it's a new role that we haven't quite worked out, and we're having to perform these things in front of people we don't know well. I mean, the one that most people have stress about is presenting in front of large groups of people, but there's so many different things that, whether it's a new leadership job or whatever, that we find ourselves reluctant to do it because we're afraid we're not going to look so good. So the book is really built on those 5 things, and how can you understand why we get reluctant to do these, why we get nervous doing them, and then how, more importantly, how can you get better at it? It turns out that, you know, part of the reason why most of us find ourselves reluctant to do those things is that for most of human history, people never had to do it. For most of human history, people lived in groups of maybe 25 to 50 people. They lived out in the wilderness, hunting and gathering food, and rarely met unfamiliar people. I would say over the course of a person's life, they might have been new 3 or 4 times. They probably would have met in their entire life. They would probably encountered 200 to 300 strangers. You know, for us these days, we meet that many people in one day just commuting to work. So our world is so different from the world that we as humans evolved in. And for much of human history, if you met a stranger, if somebody, you encountered them in the wilderness, it was usually a pretty stressful event, because it usually meant that you were either encroaching on their territory or they were coming into yours. And so there was a real survival advantage for you to be very cautious when you saw a stranger. The problem is we've inherited that, and we're born with that anxiety. Scientists have shown that babies about 6 months after they're born start to feel anxious around strangers. It's something that we're genetically hardwired to do. And we never quite lose that as we get older. Also, as a child, I think most of us were taught either by parents or by teachers, don't talk to strangers. We're sort of drilled into our heads that that's a dangerous thing to do. And sometimes what kids will internalize that is all strangers are bad. And so they grow up thinking, oh, I can't talk to strangers because that's dangerous. Yet we live in a world economy that's entirely built on our ability to interact with strangers. I mean, world commerce, even local commerce, could not happen if it wasn't for our ability to interact with strangers. So it's something that in our current world we just have to get better at. And the book is really to help you understand why we get nervous in it and then what to do about it. So let me give you one example out of the book in terms of trying to understand why we're nervous in it and then what we can do about it, and that is, how do you introduce yourself to strangers? I've interviewed hundreds of people over time, and I found that one of the most common things that people don't like to do is to go up to strangers they don't know and introduce themselves. And yet most everybody will say, hey, I know I got to do this. I know that's what's going to lead me to my next job or lead me to a new customer or a client, but I just don't want to do that. And in fact, while a lot of people will think that that is something's wrong with them, it turns out that pretty much everybody has that feeling. Even people who are extroverted and very outgoing, they still feel reluctant too. In fact, there was a study done at Columbia University in the United States where they took a bunch of executives and they asked them to come to an event, and 95% of the executives said that their goal for the event was to meet new people. So they asked each executive to look at the invitation list and identify who they knew, and when they walked into that event, they gave them a badge that allowed the researchers to track who talked to who for the event. And what they found was, even though all of these executives said, I'm here to meet new people, most of them walked into this room, found somebody they knew, walked over to them, and spent most of the event talking to people they knew, and rarely ever talked to somebody they didn't know. So if highly successful executives will do that, it's not surprising that the rest of us might feel reluctant to do that as well. So why are we reluctant to do it? Well, it turns out, through at least my research, what I found is there's sort of 4 things that cause us to have that anxiety, cause us to talk ourselves out of actually going up to that person, introducing ourselves. And these are basically what they are. The first one is for a lot of people, they just don't want to interrupt that other person. They feel it's an intrusion, the other person's time is valuable, and so they'll talk themselves out of approaching them because they just don't want to intrude upon that other person. For others, they've heard all the research that says that first impressions are important and that somebody will determine whether they like you or not within the first 30 seconds of meeting you, and that puts so much pressure on somebody to make a good first impression that oftentimes we just don't try it in the first place. For others, it's the small talk. It's making conversation. It's afraid of knowing what to say about yourself, what questions to ask about the other person, how do you keep the conversation going. And then finally, a lot of people are reluctant to do this for the simple fact that we're all born with a natural fear of rejection. Because for much of human history, when you were rejected and pushed out of that little group of 25 to 50 people who lived out in the wilderness, it was often a death sentence, because if you were sent out into the wilderness by yourself, you're more likely to be eaten by predators, more likely to starve. And so we're born with a real fear of rejection. But we live in a world where the risk, the damage that could be done if you meet somebody, at a networking event or at a restaurant and you talk to them and for some reason it doesn't go well and they decide they don't like you or the conversation is awkward, the real impact to us is almost negligible. And yet our hardwired sort of caveman brains still feel like that's such a big deal. And so it's part of the reason why we get reluctant to do these very simple things that often make the difference in terms of us being successful. So what do you do about it? One of the interesting other things about introductions is it turns out that there are no clear etiquette rules in any culture in the world about how to introduce yourself. There are all kinds of rules about how to introduce other people, and they actually turn out to be relatively similar between cultures. And in fact, in the United States, there's Emily Post is one of the sort of premier etiquette books. It's almost 500 pages long, and in that it has.
What's the name again? I'm sorry.
Emily Post, which is. And Emily Post has a book which is 500 pages long, and in that book there are 22 pages devoted to how to introduce other people. There are whole pages devoted to how do you introduce your parents to your boss. How do you introduce your fiance to your relatives? How do you introduce the president of a country to the queen of a country? But it turns out there's almost no information about actually how to introduce yourself to other people. There are no pages about that in this entire book. And I've done research in looking at all kinds of other cultures in the world, and it's the same thing. And so that only adds to the difficulty. If there are no clear rules about when it's appropriate to introduce yourself, then naturally we are a little reluctant, a little more anxious to do it. So, real quickly, a couple ideas to make it easier when you find yourself reluctant to introduce yourself, what you can do. And again, these aren't that surprising, but it's amazing that sometimes if you just do these little things and you practice them and get better at them, you're just going to be a lot more comfortable when you approach new situations. The first one is, many times we talk ourselves out of all the reasons why we don't think the other person's going to want to talk to us. But if you simply put yourself, as we say in English, in the other person's shoes, imagine if you were the other person and they were approaching you, how would you feel? And if you'd be okay with it and you consider yourselves normal, then why don't you just consider the other person normal too and just go for it? I mean, in most cases, the risk of doing it is very, very small. The other one is kind of obvious, but it's practicing your opening lines and the things about conversation. You can do these things back at home in front of the mirror, and the more that you become comfortable, the more you try these out, the more you will find yourself a lot more confident going into new situations, because in the back of the mind you have some things that you can kind of use and say. The other thing I've found through my research is that in most conversations, the specific words you use are not that correlated to the success of the conversation. So don't worry about messing up your words and maybe flubbing your introduction a little bit. Most of the time that doesn't matter that much. It's to the extent that you show you're interested and enthusiastic, that makes a difference. And that brings up to my second point. A lot of people worry about making a good first impression. And it turns out most of the research with good first impressions is the last thing you want to do to make a good first impression is try to impress the other person. Because telling all these things about how wonderful you are, all the things you've accomplished, usually do the opposite. You sound arrogant, you sound self-absorbed. What most is important, and this is advice we've heard for 100 years at least, which is the more that making good first impressions is more about how you make the other person feel, less about what you tell them about yourself. And that really comes down to, do you show interest? Do you ask good questions? Do you show that you're respecting them, whatever their level is, whether they're a higher status than you or lower than status than you? And then finally, the other one is write things down. Most of us have horrible memories, and that's not just for names. It's all the other information we learn about people. And the problem about being new is most of the time you don't just meet one person, you meet a whole bunch of people and you get them all confused. And so if you can write things down about people, you know, the things you learn about them in addition to their name, and review that before the next time you see it, it's amazing how much more comfortable and confident you'll be walking into that room, because you will have gotten that information back into your memory, and you're just going to feel a lot more comfortable. So again, the book is designed to really help you understand why you're anxious in new situations, and then through a whole set of exercises and thoughts, how do you get better at introducing yourself, remembering names, asking questions, building relationships, and then learning how to get comfortable doing things you're not very good at yet. And then finally, there's a whole chapter on how do you help other people get better at those things, because obviously the more that we can help and pay back to the people that when we join an organization, if we can pay back by helping even newer people join and feel comfortable, that's a good thing. So basically, that's the book, and I'll stop there and see if anybody has any questions. Or Carolina, I know that you've got a lot of thoughts about challenges of being new. I know you're relatively new in your job as well, and have experienced what it means to be that. So, like I said, I'm done talking here.
Yeah, and I felt like super familiar with the situations that you described, even with those cavemen.
Right.
I can relate. I do have some questions. I don't know if Carlos wanted to start.
Well, actually, yes. I mean, I have my own set of questions, but I think your participation is more relevant due to the very nature of what Keith is talking about, and also because of your role at Nearsoft. But the only thing, I'll just save them for later. What I do want to say now is that for those who are watching us, you remember that you can send us your questions by using the Q&A prompt, the Q&A window. Just if you're looking at if you're watching us on our channel, just click on the link that says "Be part of the conversation," which is on the lower left-hand side corner of the screen. Just click in there, and it'll take you to our Q&A prompt. So send us your questions, and we'll read them off to Keith. So having said this, Carolina, I'm going to hand over the mic and to you, and you go ahead, feast.
Thanks. It's a very, maybe it's a silly question, but how do you introduce yourself? Like, if there are chapters on how to introduce other people, do you have some examples on how to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing to recognize is that often the first part of a introduction is an interruption. You know, accept the fact that it is. You're going up to somebody, they will have been doing something prior to that. Maybe they're just looking at you and you're walking toward them, but recognize that it is that. There are times where the first thing you should ask is simply, hey, is this a good time for me to introduce myself? That oftentimes will sort of give the other person an opt to sort of say, well, maybe this isn't that right amount of time, but it also is a more respectful approach than just simply walking up and sticking your hand out and saying, hi, my name is, although that often can work too. I think the other part is simply starting with, hi, my name is, and then the reason why you're introducing yourself. I mean, it sounds kind of obvious, but sometimes if you don't simply say, hey, this is my, I just joined the company, I'm in that cubicle just down the hallway, and I thought, I'm clearly going to be seeing you in the office from time to time. I thought I'd introduce myself. To the extent that you can sort of implicitly apologize for the introduction,